Hello, Dr. Carl here. I'm just putting together this, I don't know, it's probably going to be about an hour-long talk, just to kind of make up for yesterday's class. I'm sorry I had to cancel it. I hope you all got the message in time. I really was not well, and it kind of took me a while to feel normal again. Anyways, here I am. I'm going to start by apologizing to somebody who was going to do a presentation on Jeff Wall, who has now been bumped twice. Obviously, we will make up for it next week. I wanted to have them go last week just because there was an image by Jeff Wall of a photograph of somebody doing a medical illustration, which I thought would be would tie in nicely with last week's theme on anatomies. Anyways, we will get to it. So my apologies to that person. The theme for this week is natural history, and we're kind of picking up a thread that we slowly started looking at in the first couple of weeks when we looked at herbals and bestiaries and books by Conrad Gessner and who was it, Edward Fuchs and people like that. Even who is it that Swedish man, Linnaeus, that had no images, but a lot of Latin nomenclature. So we're kind of continuing to look at European scientists and what kind of information they're assembling from nature, and how it's forming some kind of body of knowledge about, I almost said a picture, and that's not quite the right word, a body of knowledge about the natural world. I'm not quite ready to use the word science yet. But some of the artists we'll talk about, or we would have talked about yesterday, go now in a different direction from those printed books, particularly the ones with those woodcuts, because we're now like really looking at the introduction of full-blown color. I think we touched upon it a little bit with those, with the Birds of North America by Jean-Jacques Audubon, J.J. John, somebody Audubon. Anyways, there's a couple of, I think there are two people on this week's list that I guess in class I would have touched upon just as a kind of a cursory mention. Albrecht Dürer, I was thinking of his a great turf of grass, I think it's called. And, his impetus to look very closely and create what's called a nature study. So a very closely observed piece of nature, that's what we would call realistic. I also, in that context, want to mention someone that I think is really worth having a closer look at. It's this Swiss German. Could I say Schweizerdeutsch? I wonder if she's Schweizerdeutsch. Anyways, Swiss family living in Frankfurt in the 17th century called Maria Merian. That's Merian. And Merian. And she unusually was a woman that was interested in the insect world and published a 2-volume set of books about insects with a particular emphasis on the metamorphosis of caterpillars. She illustrated them, she engraved them, created 50 engravings per volume, which was really, really unusual, and described their life cycles, also very unusual. I think caterpillars and the life cycle was not well understood at that time. I think people just thought they kind of spontaneously emerged, and so she contributed to the appreciation of caterpillars as something that's, in the process of becoming a wonderful butterfly. Anyway, the illustrations for her books are really phenomenal and particularly unusual because she was a woman. So try and look up some of the images. Another person I want to mention again that kind of represents a departure from the natural history books that we looked at is a Frenchman by the name of Jean-Baptiste Oudry, Oudry. He was where did my notes on him? I thought I had some. I thought I made some notes about him. Oh yeah, maybe here. Okay. He was kind of involved in the court life of France, and had kind of close, I'm not going to say close relations, but here we go. Here's the note that I was looking for. His association with the courts led to a lot of commissions to create canvases that decorated a lot of country homes that were associated with the various French monarchs. And so he excelled at painting what's called game. And game is, what is hunted by the aristocracy, or was hunted by the aristocracy, things like deer and fowl, so birds, pheasants, foxes, hares, things like that. So these, upper class people, I think this actually still happens in England and in the countryside in England, that the upper classes go out on horseback and go on a hunt, and then bring back their, for the sake of Oudry in the 17th, I think it's like late 17th and early 18th century, he would paint these. So these are like local animals. He's not looking to capture exotic species that, from the farthest reaches of the empire, but rather to paint local animals that were part of this hunt. Here they're arranged in compositions, a little bit like Audubon's birds, and they are dead. They're not restaged to look alive. Like the rabbits will be like hanging so that their blood is drained out of them, because that's what you do before you're going to prepare something for cooking. But they were arranged in beautiful compositions. Sometimes they were, there were like fruit, flowers, what have you, that were added to make things look particularly appealing and decorative. Decorative is the word there, not scientific. So they are realistic, they're beautiful, but they're not scientific. They're accurate, but they're not scientific. And they were oil paintings on canvas, not woodcuts in a book. So that's Jean-Baptiste Oudry. Again, if you can do a quick Google of him and have a look at his works, that would be great. I think there might be a Wikipedia page with some of his works. And then finally, another person to mention that kind of, bridges what we looked at 2 weeks ago from what we're about to look at in a few minutes, the paintings of George Stubbs. And Stubbs was, I don't have too much to say about him actually, just that he was involved very much with equestrian culture, which I think I might have mentioned at some point. I feel like I said something about it a few weeks ago, but I don't know now if it's this class or another class. Anyway, equestrian culture, that means horses, were super important because there weren't any cars. So the study of horses, the medicine, the fixing of horses, the taking care of horses was like way more important back then than it was today, because if you wanted to travel anywhere, you needed a good horse. And so George Stubbs became known as a painter of horses, and again, have a look at his canvases. These are quite large, not life-size, but fairly large, almost like portraits of horses in profile. They're all kind of pretty regularly in profile. He is, again, interested in accuracy, but just that one species. So I would say both, Stubbs in particular belongs to a group of painters in the early 19th century. Maybe he was a bit late 18th, early 19th, that come to be known as animal painters. People start painting their animals. People start thinking in kind of a nostalgic way about barnyard animals. In fact, people start kind of, the whole idea of like having domesticated animals, for instance, that come into the house as pets. That starts to be quite a common occurrence. In fact, a few people get so attached to their dogs in the 19th century that they have their portraits painted, something that's kind of commonplace now, but again in the 19th century was very unusual because oil painting was such a privilege and so expensive, a luxury, that most people couldn't afford that expense. And lost my train of thought. Oh, and of course, animals don't sit still like human sitters do. That's the main barrier to the wedding of animal subjects and oil painting. Now, having kind of touched upon very, very briefly those instances, perhaps in as a way of giving a nod to what we might associate as what we might think of as artistic practice, as opposed to scientific practice. I'm now going to try and kind of address this pretty amazing article by, I think her name is Karen Wonders, The Art of Taxidermy from 1800 to 1900. I think that's who wrote this, Karen Wonders. I could be horribly wrong. Anyway, it's on our reading course, under course readings. And it really kind of, this new, I'm not going to say art of taxidermy, but new practice of taxidermy really sort of presents a very new approach. Well, certainly a departure from the encyclopedic efforts of those authors that I mentioned. Again, of the sort of like author or publishers in the, almost like in the spirit of the Renaissance. They're trying to be as encyclopedic as possible to get a description and and some kind of little image, a woodcut or an engraving of every species in the world. It's almost like their approach is modeled. It always reminds me of Noah's Ark, of having like one of everything. That was their approach. In fact, like at some point it struck me that Noah's Ark is kind of like a proto example of the gentleman scientist's approach to nature, or approach to his curiosity cabinet. You know, that was his ideal, was to have one of everything. And I don't know if you would, I don't know how many of you read the paper by Karen Wonders, but oh, hang on. She kind of sketched an evolution of the practice whereby different practitioners in different activities, all of whom were men, are slowly kind of coming together and cobbling together something that would eventually become the museum diorama. And if I were there in front of you in the lecture hall, I would ask you how many, I'm kind of curious how many of you know what I'm talking about when I say a museum diorama. How many of you have been to a natural history museum and seen a museum diorama? Because it's a really kind of culturally specific construction. And it's a really, you know, it's something that I grew up kind of looking at from time to time. I would get taken to natural history museums either through a school program or by my parents. And they didn't really strike me as, there's nothing strange, that I kind of like accepted them as truth. And of course now I've come to see of them as fiction, as some kind of desire to recreate the world and or some a microcosm of the world. And you know, they definitely embody a big contradiction, namely the desire to get closer to nature, and at the same time divorcing us from nature. They're keeping us at a distance from the real world. So I thought they were a really interesting thing to consider, and particularly because their formulation rests on so many practices that we associate with the arts or with the visual arts. And yet, to some degree, they're quasi, maybe not quasi-scientific, they're pseudo-scientific. That's the right word. So I thought the Karen Wonders article was really, well, that's why I included it for us to read. She, and I guess the first kind of obvious thing to state is that the emergence of the diorama, or the maybe I'll back up and say the emergence of the phenomenon of taxidermy happens with the interaction by two very different kinds of men. One is an explorer or a hunter, an outdoorsman, someone who is going out, whether locally or really, really far, like he's joining an expedition and crossing an ocean and going and you know, walking around in the wilderness in the backwoods of Canada or Quebec, just like Louis Nicolas was. And he's hunting, he's trapping, he's capturing little or large, mid-size, let's say, animals and skinning them. And the reason he's doing that is that once you separate the skins, animal skins or bird skins, from their innards, there's a lesser degree of decomposition. Now, I think we heard that, obviously the innards are thrown away, and then you're left with the skin. And so that person would then travel back to Europe and meet up with 9 times out of 10 a bit of a what's called a gentleman scientist, somebody that usually, most of the time, a man that had a cabinet of curiosities. And he would be able to sell this animal skin or bird skin to that gentleman scientist, who would then endeavor to restage that skin into some kind of scenario. Maybe I should say he would prize that skin as something that's unusual, like a rarity for his cabinet of curiosities. Now, the question of staging, I think that was the part that underwent quite a bit of change throughout the article that she described. I think we got the impression that at least in the 18th century, late 18th century, skins were stuffed with straw, and they were quote unquote mounted. The first person to use that term was somebody called Louis Dufresne, Dufresne, in 1803, who used the term mounted. Somebody called Jean-Baptiste Becoeur, Becoeur, had already established the use of arsenic to fix the skin so that they didn't decompose any further. And first of all, those skins were stuffed with straw, and I guess that was initially gave an unsatisfactory and unnatural appearance. And they were set against just a white paper background, put into a vitrine, a box with a glass window to look through, and and then kind of arranged in such a way that people weren't terribly happy with. And in particular, one of the problems was that this gentleman scientist doing the arranging had absolutely no clue where the skin had come from, and what the habitat of the animal was like, what the movement of that body was normally like, how specifically it should be staged. So there was a great deal of frustration with those early examples of taxidermy. And various people over the years kind of advocated, or various practitioners advocated over the years. If they were critical about anything, they were always writing about the emphasis on the manners, and I think what they called a characteristic attitude, an attitude that or a gesture or a pose that characterized that animal. So a great example of that, for instance, would be, a tiger. Often you see paintings, or you see, not paintings, but models of tigers maybe in these natural history museums, and they're always like staged, with their fangs out in a kind of angry look, as if they're about to pounce on something, claws out. That's a characteristic attitude. It's almost like a stereotype of what people then associated with it. People then wouldn't be so carried away or convinced if they saw a tiger just curled up asleep like a little kitten, as it probably is 50% of the time. They were looking for a characteristic attitude. And that kind of, sounds like more of an artistic concern rather than a scientific one. The science was looking at what was their morphology like, what was their skeletal structure like, things like that, and what were they actually eating, what was the contents of their stomach. But the taxidermist was looking at, like I said, or in search of a characteristic attitude. Now, the Karen Wonders then describes a couple of other subsequent taxidermists. One is called Charles Peale, that's Peale, who is an American, and he contributes a couple of devices to this genre, is that the right word? Practice. For instance, he's the first person to start carving some of the limbs that go into the skins. He carves them in wood, which greatly improves some of the, I guess what we're talking about, that characteristic attitude. He also starts using glass eyes. Don't know what kind of eyes they were previously looking at, but they weren't made of glass, and obviously they weren't convincing. He is also the first person to add a painted background to the case itself, or the box. So he started painting skies and very simple landscapes behind this molded animal in the foreground. So that already kind of is a game changer for this practice. Couple of subsequent people. William Bullock is mentioned. He's an Englishman from Bullock. He had a museum of taxidermy in Piccadilly, London. He was really more interested in staging these animals now with a lot of motion. He had zero interest in maintaining kind of a geographic purity, but rather he'd throw a bunch of random animals together, seals, panthers, lemurs, from any kind of corner of the world, all together in the same display. He was a hunter, and his sort of modus operandi was to create what he called sporting trophies. And I think he was the person that ended up being the taxidermist to the king or queen. And he also included large panoramic paintings in the backgrounds of some of his displays. So that was his contribution. I guess the final thing to say about him is just an emphasis on drama and theater, excitement, something to move the crowds, to get them all riled up for them to imagine that there's some kind of event happening between a tiger and a seal. Charles Walterton is mentioned. Who else? Oh, Johann Friedrich Naumann, Naumann. Painted a lot of landscapes behind his mounted animals. He was the first person to kind of create different, like a real foreground, middle ground, background. So like in the background, there would be a landscape painting, in the middle ground would be the animal. And in the foreground, he would collect a bunch of branches and grasses and create some kind of a much more three-dimensional space for the display, for to imagine a full three-dimensional scene that the animal was situated in. Finally, well, maybe at this point I should mention that while all this activity is happening around, well, Europe and North America, maybe further east, really all over the world, I suspect, the rise of nationalism in the 19th century starts to really take a hold, and we see the emergence of these, or the rise of these natural history museums in different countries. And their objective is really to showcase all the wonderful animals that are indigenous to their particular nation. And so that is what's kind of behind the places like the Natural History Museum in London, which is really quite a remarkable and noteworthy phenomenon unto itself. There's in fact two films on YouTube that I think are worth watching. There's one that is really, really kind of antiquated. Let me see if I can, here we go. Yeah, it's this one, so it's really, it almost makes me like, I don't know whether to cringe or to laugh. The title of it is The Natural History Museum and ampersand Alfred Waterhouse Architecture. So Alfred Waterhouse was the architect behind that building, and for many reasons it's really an unusual building. It was kind of modeled after a medieval church, basically, except that this architect, Waterhouse, really endeavored to replace all of the Christian iconography with natural history iconography. So there are all these, so like the capitals on the columns are different plants from around the British Isles. And one of the things I think is just the most amazing thing is that right along all of the ribs inside an archway, he has actually carved the bones of a vertebrae, which is an extremely Darwinian thing to do. And in fact, there are little monkeys, some carved into the vertebrae that are kind of scampering around. And you can see this here and there on this film. It's, like I said, it's very old, and the guy's accent kind of, is a little bit aristocratic. It's a 25-minute film, but really worth it just as a kind of walk through. And like I said, just to kind of document what that building is about and how it was kind of seen as a temple of British nationhood. British was seen as a kind of place where British people could come and celebrate and marvel at specimens of local nature. Now, the flip side of that is another YouTube. I guess I'll put these links on your Brightspace for this week. Another YouTube link that comes from the very same institution at the Natural History Museum in London. They have an institute called the Darwin Center, and they have made a pretty awesome 5-minute flick called Preserving a Giant Squid. and it's so amazing because it gives you a sense that like this institution is no longer like what that the other film depicts. It's not dusty or old-fashioned, any of that stuff. It's really, really, I mean, they're still collecting things, and I'd kind of rather they left them where they were. But so they still have a institutional mission that I kind of is not exactly the most eco-friendly. But in fact, you could say they're still kind of working in the service of those Renaissance scholars or authors, I don't know what to call them, namely trying to collect one of everything. Anyways, the thing about this film is that squid is 8 meters long. It's huge. It's much bigger than me. It's bigger than me and my children lined up. It's very impressive. And anyways, and I guess it did die of natural causes, so why not display it if somebody's going to learn from it or enjoy it. Anyway, so I will put those 2 links on your Brightspace for you to watch. Finally, I would like to wrap up by mentioning 2 I guess one of them is a contemporary artist and the other is a modern artist. And they're both people who were influenced by natural history aesthetics, but kind of yanked things over more in the, I shouldn't say yanked, maybe just steered things over more into the into more of the realm of the visual arts. The first is someone called Joseph Cornell, who was a kind of was an American modern artist, a bit of a eccentric. He was definitely a recluse. He made his name by making little boxes where he would which I guess are considered kind of quasi-surrealist. They are definitely in the vein of assemblages. And they're also very much, they also take a page out of this whole natural history process and often incorporate taxidermied birds or, little parrots or finches or what have you, but together with different objects that he finds. He was somebody that liked to go to thrift stores and kind of poke about in odd little places, find unusual objects, and juxtapose things such that they became an assemblage, that they didn't really, unlike a diorama or one of the taxidermied boxes that is striving for authenticity, striving for accuracy. Joseph Cornell is a surrealist, and he's striving for confusion and eclecticism and humor, and so on, sort of a much more chaotic, layered composition. So, but still definitely with one foot in the natural history tradition. So if you have a way of finding some images, I think if you just Google Joseph Cornell art boxes, you'll see what I mean. And finally, the last person to have a look at is the tanks or the vitrine of Damien Hirst. You might know that name already. He's still practicing, still alive, almost still a young man. Maybe he's my age. A British artist who made his name with a number of very, very large tanks displaying animals in some kind of fixing solution. Maybe it's formaldehyde. Very, very large. These are now very large animals, like a life-size white shark. I think that work was called The Physical Impossibility in the Mind of Someone Living. It's like 2004. There were also a couple of lambs, sheep. I think he had cows that were in these tanks. So and they were displayed in galleries, which some people might argue, oh, well, then it's art. If you find it in a gallery or in a museum, it's definitely art. But they're animals, and they're in vitrine, and we're kind of invited to look at them. They're not, I guess, apart from the shark, they're kind of farm animals, agrarian, not exotic in any way. But they kind of, and they're not, I guess, they're not staged to look alive. There's no interest in a characteristic attitude. They're definitely dead. They're not decomposing, but they're dead. And I guess we're just invited to, the viewer is invited to look at their appearance, look at their bodies, observe them as, look at their otherness, because they're dead. In fact, I remember, I have a quote from him. He said, somebody asked him about what's he doing putting these animals in these tanks. He said it's completely isolated. The animal is completely isolated from its natural setting. Instead of being in motion in the water, we see it completely frozen and preserved. For most, it may be the first time we've come so close to a shark, with many of us only seeing them on television or perhaps at an aquarium. Here we have a direct experience of the shark, not filtered through any media. Thus, we're forced to consider the shark in a new and different context and reevaluate how we perceive the animal. In Hirst's piece, we come face to face with the reality and physicality of this familiar image and are forced to consider it in a new setting. Like I said, Hirst and Joseph Cornell it's almost like they have a foot in each camp. I think that wraps up everything I want to say about today's or yesterday's class. Yeah, look for I hope, again, I'm sorry I hope I didn't cause too much inconvenience. And I will see you next week at the usual place and time. And check out the videos on YouTube. Like I said, I'll put 2 links under this week's course or Brightspace. Okay, bye-bye.